Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fifth in our series of Urban Tree webinars as part of the Urban Tree Festival. My name's Neil Sinden. I'm Director of CPRE London, the countryside charity working for a greener city. And we're hosting the webinar series, and it's great to see so many of you coming into the webinar as I speak. We're going to wait a few seconds for others to join us. But for the time being, that's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Andrew Stuck, who will say a few words about the Tree Festival as a whole and the plan for managing this session. Over to you, Andrew.
Okay, welcome everybody. Well, we've got people piling into the meeting, so we'll start very shortly. We'd like to have lots of opportunity for a discussion afterwards. So each of the presenters are going to keep their presentations to about 10 to 12 minutes so that we have plenty of time for discussion. What we would love you to do is to share your knowledge and ideas in the chat. So at the bottom of the screen, you'll find there's a thing called chat, and you can chip in suggestions and ideas. And just to get that going, I thought we would ask you to type into the chat where you're from or where you are now. If you step outside, do you actually see a street tree when you step outside? And how long is it that you've been interested in street trees? It might be only in the last 90 seconds, but we're hoping that it's a little bit longer than that and that we can get some idea. And I'm going to say my situation is that I live in Greenwich. I live on a treeless street. So I would actually have to put down that my answer would be Greenwich, no. And I've been interested in street trees for about 5 years. So do chip in information in that way. So that's how the chat kind of works. We also want to encourage you to chip in suggestions and ideas. When we've done street tree walks, we've often gone out with a group of people, and the combined knowledge of the group is fascinating and really valuable. So please do chip in knowledge, because even though I'm sitting alongside some experts, they too, I'm sure, would be happy to learn new things. And finally, we have a Q&A spot. That's also on the bottom of the screen. So what's important here is that you do post questions, and there's an opportunity to discuss them afterwards. We'd really ask you to keep the chat to chat and the questions to questions, and not try and confuse them up, because often we miss a question or we overlook it. So let's see how we, Neil, on sort of numbers. Are we sort of ready to go? Oh, I think we are. He's on mute, so we can't tell. He's talking silently at me. So
we've got over 80 joiners now, so we're ready to go.
Okay, that's brilliant. Okay, so first up is Paul Wood. He's the author of London Street Trees. Now, Paul and I have been doing walks for some time, so I know Paul very well. I'm looking forward to his presentation. But what I wanted to just draw on is that I only actually got interested in street trees really because I met Paul. And it would be nice to imagine that I've been sort of interested in street trees for years, but that's not actually the case. And the thing that I like to explore here really is the fact that many of us come to learning about nature and having an affinity to trees at different times in our lives. Some people would say, oh, you know, you introduce it to children and it's there for life. But I actually had a professional entomologist in my family, and I can assure you I was completely put off by nature, because that's exactly what I had to put up with all the time. So I didn't really get into nature until much later in life. So I think people come from, at different times, they come into an enthusiasm for nature, and some people go on and get qualifications for it. And amongst our panelists, we have a botanist and we have an engineer and tree officer expert. So lots to hear from those people who are accredited, but I'm going to hand you over now to Paul Wood, who is one of those people who had a passion, had a hobby, and has made it into something really special.
Well, thank you, Andrew. That was a great introduction. What Andrew neglected to say is I have no training in any of these disciplines which the other panelists do. And so I'm entirely self-taught. And forgive me for any mistakes I might make. But what I thought I'd do is start by talking about the history of street trees in London. So I hope you can see the shared screen. And coming up on your screen about now is an image, a black and white photograph taken in, I think it was about 1901. And this is Muswell Hill, which is very close to the border with Barnet. I think this is just in Haringey, but it's, I think it was Windermere Road. And you can see that if anyone knows Muswell Hill, it's a very leafy suburb of North London that was built between about 1899 and the beginning of the First World War. And as part of that development, they planted street trees systematically on the streets around that area. And this was really the sort of heyday of street tree planting in London, which was between about 1870 and the beginning of the First World War, so 1914. And the tree which was most favoured was the London plane. And you can see that legacy all over London. Next up is Kennington Lane, and this is older. This is would be in the 19th century, and these are a magnificent boulevard of London plane trees that have been left to attain their full height. They haven't been pollarded like many London planes have, which are in areas like that street in Muswell Hill, for instance, where they were not necessarily the right choice. And I'm sure Andy will talk something about this now, that if they were replanting Muswell Hill now, they might not choose London planes for the job because of the maintenance that they require, and maybe they're not ideally sized for some of the narrower streets. You can see behind me, this is Jerningham Road in New Cross, which is a street of pollarded plane trees, and that's something that often gets some questions about, is pollarding. So I wonder whether anybody wants to chip in with a question about it, and we can have a discussion about that afterwards. This is moving back to Muswell Hill. So this is 120 years later, and this is not exactly the same street, but you can see how the London planes are faring on a street in Muswell Hill, and you can see that they are being very well maintained by the local authority there. And they have to do that because of the space which is required for these trees. London planes, of course, are iconic London street tree, but it's changing. So next up is a quote, and this is from a book written by A.D. Webster in 1920, 100 years ago, London's Trees, or London Trees. And it's a fantastic book. It's a kind of collection of notes, really. But A.D. Webster was a park keeper at Greenwich Park and had a passion for trees. But he wrote one chapter about street trees in this book, and it pretty much says there's not much to talk about. It's 60% of it is plane trees. So he estimated that 60% of street trees in London were London planes back in 1920. Since then, it's changed dramatically. And now, according to an iTree report, which came out in, I think, 2015, 2016, it's about 3% of street trees in London are London planes. And that's not necessarily because we've lost lots of London planes. It's probably mostly because we've had a whole load of other trees planted. Next up are a couple of trees which are also kind of old school. So like the London plane, these would be the types of trees that would have been planted in Webster's day. So on the left is a poplar, which is very heavily pollarded. This one's in Barnet, actually. And on the right is a common lime, or I'm not sure which way around you're seeing it, but hopefully you know the difference between them, but one's much more heavily pollarded than others. So these were the types of trees which were more common in that period. So these would have taken up the rest of that 40% that weren't London planes. Poplars you very rarely see nowadays. They become huge trees. They're not very long lived and they're rather weak. And lime trees are not as well suited to the urban environment perhaps as plane trees, or certainly the common lime, which this is, Tilia cross-europea. And of course, they are the bane of motorists because of the honeydew, which is excreted by the aphids that thrive on their leaves. So anybody that lives in a leafy part of London with these on their street may well know all about that. As well as street trees that have been planted in this period, and there is still the legacy of trees which have been adopted as street trees. So this is a mulberry tree in the inexplicably named Pine Tree Way in Lewisham. And this is a very old mulberry tree. It's a local landmark in Lewisham and produces abundant and gorgeous fruit every late summer, which is picked clean by people in that part of London who know about it. It's thought, according to Peter Coles, the mulberry expert, who did a talk yesterday, I don't know whether anybody went to that, about mulberries in Chiswick, but he told me that this tree was once in a school, and it was quite a habit that they had in Victorian schools, was planting mulberries, around which people would dance and sing the mulberry song, which I've now forgotten and I won't sing it. But anyway, here it is, a mulberry tree that was once not a street tree and now is a street tree. And that happens quite a lot. And you certainly see that in the more outer parts of London, where trees that were once part of some other landscape have been adopted as street trees. But it's not a common thing. Here's some other trees that you might see nowadays. These are both native trees, which I think I would certainly like to see more of. One is the hornbeam, which of course is perhaps London's tree. It's a native tree very much to London. All the native woodlands in London, like Coleford Wood, Oxley's Wood, Highgate Woods, and so on, will all have lots of hornbeams in them, and hornbeam thrives here. And the other one is a rather rare tree, which is the wild service tree. Wild service tree, Sorbus torminalis, for those who like a Latin name, is related to the rowan and the whitebeam. Again, it's a tree which is found in London, naturally occurring in London. There's some huge ones on Hampstead Heath, and you'll again see it in places like Oxley's Wood and Queen's Wood and other London woodlands. It seems to thrive better than rowan and whitebeam do on the street as well, and I suspect we might see more of this in the future. So going back into the history of street trees, and someone that we that needs a mention is Ada Salter. Ada Salter was the mayor of Bermondsey, and Bermondsey was a borough all by its own. Now it's swallowed up into the super borough of Southwark, but before 1965, it was its own borough. Ada Salter was the mayor at around 1920, and Ada set about with her beautification committee, turning Bermondsey into what was close to a garden city or a garden village. And she very much favoured one particular tree, which was the tree of heaven. The tree of heaven, Ailanthus altissima, is a large, fast-growing, short-lived tree with very attractive foliage. But it's a tree which is now somewhat feral, perhaps, for want of a better word. And I'm sure that Sophie's noticed some of these in colonising tree pits of other trees, perhaps. And it's a tree which is now becoming quite invasive in some parts of London. So it's a tree which you rarely see. And well, you see a lot, but you very rarely see it as a street tree now, except for mature examples. And what's interesting about Bermondsey is that you can actually trace the boundaries of the former borough of Bermondsey by the tree of heavens, which are planted in that borough. So if you wander around that part of London, you'll see a lot of tree of heavens, elderly ones, not young ones, that have been a legacy from the Ada Salter years and when Bermondsey was its own borough. So I think that's one of the things that you see in London is each borough is responsible for the trees on its streets, and each borough has a different character because of the trees on its streets. And you will notice that in certain areas you'll find different trees because generations of tree officers have maybe favoured different trees for particular reasons. And that legacy becomes something which I've found very fascinating and is something that you can see still going on and happening in London. We'll maybe go a bit more into that later on, perhaps in the Q&A. But I thought I'd bring up some species which are now much more commonly planted, which you may see around. So trees which have been sort of planted in the last 20 years or so. The red one is an American sweet gum, liquid amber. And I think I noticed in the chat, someone had liquid ambers outside their house. So this one is in Deptford, and there's a whole street of them, and they get incredible colour in the autumn. And it's a tree which is perhaps being planted to supplement or to be there as a sort of backup, perhaps, for the London plane. It's a big tree from North America, attractive foliage, not unlike a London plane, very good autumn colour. The other one, the golden canopied one, is a Persian ironwood. This one's in Hackney. Persian ironwood is a fairly new tree to our streets, and again has attractive autumn foliage. Quite often you see them in parks and so on as a multi-stemmed tree, but the horticultural industry is now developing these types of trees as street trees, and this is a great example of the diversity which we're now seeing on the streets of London. So moving on, here's a couple more trees in Hackney, one of which is quite an old-fashioned tree, which is one that we would have seen at one time a lot more than we do now, and that's the one with the pink blossom, which is an almond. And this is in Haggerston. It's obviously taken a bit of a knock, that one, judging by its angle to the street. But it's a very particularly early flowering tree, member of the prunus family. It's Prunus dulcis, so it's related to the cherries and has very attractive blossom, which can sometimes appear as early as January. And could be a tree which maybe we could see as part of the palette more widely planted because of this blossom. I've got one, I live in North London near Finsbury Park, and there's one near me which is an absolute local landmark. It has incredible pink blossom in January. And the one on the right is one of the new trees, a really new tree that we're only just beginning to see. And I'm wondering whether Andy's got any of these on the streets of Barnet. It's a trident maple, Acer bulgarianum, which is an Asian species and has three-lobed leaves, hence the name trident. Quite gangly looking, but I think it's got a lot of potential, certainly very well suited to life on the front line. Next up is another tree which we're beginning to see quite a bit of. This is a hibiscus, and hibiscus is a tree that again is from Asia. Lots of our street trees originate in Asia. And I think that's something that I'm sure will come up in the Q&A, is about the difference between native and non-native. Of course, many trees on the streets are non-native, and I think we have to bear in mind that the environment on the street is very different to the environment that we'll see in the wild. So, for instance, you have to cope with the urban heat island effect, which means that temperatures can be 10 degrees higher, particularly at night in central London. This tree is in Shoreditch. Garden Walk is completely planted with these. Right, I'm going to rattle on a bit faster. Here's a tree which is actually in front garden, this one, but I think this was a discarded houseplant. It's a Norfolk Island pine, and I think it shows how climate change might allow these types of trees to be planted. A tree which you would otherwise see lining the seafront in Nice and other Mediterranean towns. Seen it in New Zealand and Australia, originally from Norfolk Island in the Pacific. This is a street without trees. There's a few of those around, but that's all beginning to change thanks to local groups and so on. So here's another quote, which I'm going to let you read, and it's about, I was going to talk about this, but I'm running out of time, so we're going to have to stop. But I was going to talk about how trees were historically kind of assigned to aspirational parts of London. So if you had a grand avenue, you'd find planes. and the unadorned macadam would be for the wage earners. That street was in Lewisham. Next up is a Persian silk tree, which is outside Brockley Station. And that's been planted by Street Trees for Living, which is a group in Lewisham, which is working in partnership with the council to raise funds to plant trees in an area where there isn't a great deal of money for planting trees. And street trees are fairly low down the priority list of that local authority. But it's a great example of how local communities are getting involved and working in partnership with the council and beginning to really brighten up some corners of Lewisham. Brockley Station has a mini forest of Persian silk trees outside it, a beautiful pink blossom in the summer. Finally, this is my book. If anybody's interested, can be purchased from my website, thestreettree.com. But then I just had a question for Andy as well. I was up in Barnet and I saw this tree and I had no idea what it was. And I was hoping that Andy might be able to tell me. It's quite close to High Barnet Station. I've got a close-up of it as well. It has unusual bark and leaves, which I just couldn't place it. There are no signs of flowers or anything. And so I thought I'd throw that in to put Andy on the spot, I'm afraid. Sorry about that, Andy.
Thank you very much. I think it is Australia, possibly, Australia carpinifolia, the hop hornbeam. And we have been planting quite a lot of those. They are very well suited to urban settings, or it could be a Celtis, Australis or Occidentalis, the nettle tree. Could be.
Okay, is anyone in the audience can come to our aid? Anyone, any suggestions, pop them in the chat. Anyway, thanks very much, Paul, for that really intriguing and interesting romp through street tree history. Now we're over to Andy Tipping. Andy is a tree officer and arboricultural manager in Barnet, in the London Borough of Barnet, and he's going to talk about strategic tree planting. And now, just as an aside, as I said, Paul and I have done quite a lot of street tree walks together, and I'm a qualified urban designer, and what I usually do is I come out with some crass remark about tree pits, when actually I haven't really got a clue about what I'm talking about. And Paul's pretty quick at putting me right, but I reckon if I went out with Andy, he'd certainly put me in the box. Anyway, I'm really looking forward to his presentation, and please keep the questions coming. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Paul, let's quickly go through some of your little questions there that you'd said. We did plant a load of trident maples in Barnet, but they all died off, and I think we might have had a bad batch from the nursery. We got them replaced. Wild service tree is definitely a better tree to plant than rowan in London. Rowan's a tree for a mountainside, really. I've never seen a decent mature rowan in London, and I have no idea why anyone plants them. We certainly don't plant them in Barnet. Or one of my planting manager might sneak a few in there, but you know, generally not. Ailanthus is definitely an invasive tree. They're all in the railway sidings in Berlin. I was there a couple of years ago. You could just see them everywhere, popping out of, God, near people's basements and things. And I think they're banned planting in New York. Almonds suffering from peach leaf curl. That's why we've planted some, and peach leaf curl is a fungal disorder on the leaves of them. And poplars, we don't plant poplars, and I will show you why on my final slide about risk. So my talk is regarding three simple areas of street tree management. One is policy, the second is planting and strategic tree planting, and finally managing street trees with regard to risk. So could I have the first slide, please? And I haven't got any notes at the bottom of these slides, by the way, so I'm going to have to make it up as I go along. Okay, so policy is so important. I think you know, if you're talking about street trees, then I think you have to look at the elephant in the room, which is Sheffield. And I think we all, any of us who understand what's happened in Sheffield over the past sort of 5, 6, 7 years, and the kind of publicity that it generated, would understand that Sheffield didn't have a tree policy. It was fortuitous because at Barnet, we've been trying to get a policy strategy together for a number of years and never really got round to it properly. And several things happened. One, that we had the the realization that nitrogen dioxide was the real problem with regard to pollution and air quality within the city. And second was Sheffield. And so we spent a while producing what was our own policy in Barnet. That's a cover. That's Acer japonicum, actually, on the front there. Sorry, Acer palmatum. It's a very, very big one in a place called Hendon Park. It's one of the great trees of London. I thought it was a big hornbeam when I first went to see it, but that is a Japanese maple. That's on the front cover of it. So we went through a process of writing the policy where we talked to a lot of other council departments, especially things like highways, and this is where Sheffield comes in, about what and how we could manage trees that were damaging footways. We did come up with a fix, which was that within the policy, there is a wording that says we will only remove trees which are damaging the footway after all engineering options have been exhausted. We had a very, very good director and a really smart strategic director of highways who both understood the value of street trees and that they were an essential part of the infrastructure of the highway. And we had started to trial different surfaces, and we all went down to Camden, met with colleagues down there, and looked at they'd been applying rubber crumb, recycled tractor tyres, I think it is, or FlexiPave is a proprietary name. They're slightly different materials, but they both have the same effect, which is a flexible footway. They're outside. If you go to the British Museum, the big planes outside the British Museum have all got rubber crumb around them, but they've been there for a number of years. The footway's fine, and you walk over it, it's slightly spongy. It's a little bit like wet paw you get in children's play areas. So we started to trial that, and then highways adopted it. It was published in our tree policy, and we use it everywhere now. And it has saved so much of the pressure that you get from colleagues in highways to remove trees that are damaging the footway, because we don't have to rely just on asphalt now. So it's innovative, and we published it, and it was agreed and passed by councillors. I think that's something else to realise, is that if you're the tree officer, if you're not fighting colleagues in highways as a tree officer, you're probably not doing your job properly. It is the bane of our lives, you know, and that's what we do. We understand it. We do understand that if we want trees in the street, they will damage the footway. It's a matter of fact. So what do you do about it? You either go the Sheffield route, which is saying, right, let's get rid of it. It's a nice cheap option. Or you go the Barnet route, which is saying, right, let's accommodate this. Let's address it. The engineering options are available. Let's use it. So it was great to get colleagues in highways on board. And then, obviously, you can have these fights with highways and stuff, but at the end of the day, you might just be a little tree officer having a tantrum in the corner because no one's going to listen to you. What you actually need is political backing. And that is how you get policy. It will be a politician who will sign it off, if you like, or even encourage it in the first place. Well, we're very lucky in Barnet in that the Cherry Environment Committee was right behind this, and some of the other councillors on there, and they helped out and signed it off. It was great. Within it, though, what else we did was about the air quality, and rather than just doing a replacement strategy, because the majority of time that I've been working there, which is 24 years now, can you believe it, we generally replace the street trees that we have to fell. This was new, though. This was planting trees in places that we'd not planted before. If you can go on to the next slide for me, please, I'll just show you a little bit of what it is. So the image on the right there, that's an overview of the borough, and that was given to us by the GLA. And you can see that the main routes is the North Circular Road, the A1, the A5 and the A41, and they're the red areas, but they're managed by Transport for London. So what we wanted to concentrate on was the subsidiary roads coming off of the major routes, that they obviously are going to be the ones with the poor air quality, with the pollution. Traffic lights, so major junctions, all the places where we've got stationary cars with the exhaust pumping it all out. So we had that. That's the air quality. We then got an image of the actual heat in Barnet, so we could understand that the areas that were hotter that we wanted to shade. The science around removing improving air quality is decent, but shade is definite. You know, I mean, if you've got big shady trees that are stopping the blacktop, the tarmac from heating up with strong sunshine, you know, we'll see it this week, and then releasing it in the evening, then shade is a really important thing too. We tended to find that they were kind of in the same areas anyway, so we could focus our planting to be strategic and to address those two issues. The image on the left there is one that I think is from Melbourne in Australia, and which was I really wanted to get a thermal camera myself, but anyway, I kind of nicked this image from there, and it has got, you can just see it, it's obvious. You've got, yeah, it's too obvious, I don't need to explain it. Okay, can we go to the next one, please? Right, so it's just a before and after shot. This is Golders Green Road. At the bottom of that road is the North Circular, the A406, the bane of my life. And we focused on this. So this was a street that had never had trees in it before. So we went out. We all did cat and Jenny scanning training last year with the LTOA, and we went and bought our own cat and Jenny scanner to not have to rely on colleagues in highways or contractors to do the scanning for us. We do it all ourselves now. And we located the voids because, you know, the roads, the footway's full of services. The planting that we did on the Edgware Road several years ago, I had 22 kilometres of road to plant. So I had 22,000 potential planting pits, and we found like 110 voids in 22 kilometres of road. And you know, we planted 90 metasequoias on the Edgware Road, but essentially I could have planted a whole forest down there, but it's just packed full of services. So here we find the voids. We've bought the tree species. I think we planted elm and maple down here, so we want big tree species because we've got the space. When I talk about the risk thing, you know, you plant your trees and you have to take into account the risk. This part of North London is a lot of clay. We have a lot of subsidence cases, and we know we have to address those and plant the right tree in the right place. That hibiscus that Paul showed, I was very wary about the hibiscus a couple of years ago when I first saw them, but they've really grown on me. And there's one around the corner from where I live, and I look at it all the time. And it flowers throughout the summer. It's actually a really good little tree. You know, we're planting a lot of good smaller trees. I think, you know, we've actually got mature amelanchias all over East Finchley now that we planted 25 years ago, and they're you know, they're mature amelanchias now. They've never caused a problem with the buildings. They're really good tree. Anyway, so this is Golders Green Road. We planted this up last winter, and there you can see the before and after. Give it 5 or 10 years, like Paul did with his images earlier, and we'll see that's going to make a major difference to that road. Okay, next one, please. Okay, so the rubber crumb thing was we did it for its obviously for its flexibility, but then we had an LTOA thing, and Andy Lederer, I think it was, took this film, which is going very, very slowly, but you'll see. That's asphalt on the top where the contractor is, and this is the rubber crumb. Okay. So it's permeable, basically. What that means is that was in a road called Armitage Road in NW11. And we have about 80 tree pits in that road, all of which have been treated with this. That does mean that each of those tree pits is probably about 3 meters square. So you say 2 meters by 1 meter, and then go a meter deep. That each of those tree pits has the water holding capacity as a sustainable underground drainage system. That's the SUDS now. This is why I say it's an unexpected benefit. We put that material down purely for its flexible material qualities, and we just didn't realise that actually we just put a SUDS in, and so we have tried to quantify the value of that. I'd contacted someone at the Environment Agency to see how much water we were in each storm occasion that wasn't going into the drainage system, and the flood risk of properties further down the hill and stuff. We haven't really got anywhere with that, but I think in the future that that's something to explore a lot more, because it is a more expensive material to lay than asphalt. But if we can demonstrate that, one, you don't need to continue relaying it, it's more sustainable. That around those trees, like I say, at the British Museum, big planes, 10 years it's been there. For our street trees, we're hoping there for to be there for at least 10 years, whereas the asphalt would have to be replaced every 3 to 4 years. If we can then add on the value of the water holding capacity of those pits, I think it will be, you know, it's a piece of work to do, but we can then, that material will be more widely distributed, I hope. Okay, next slide, please, because I'm running out of time. Ah, we're missing a photograph. Oh, there it is. Okay, so one of the things about street tree management is we've got to make sure they're safe. And someone talked earlier about the different levels of education and stuff, and professional arboriculturists like myself doing that. Now, I got qualified in ARB, but in a night school at Capel Manor College, and then I did day release at Barnet again at Capel Manor. But it was actually really quite cheap. That kind of adult education that's available for people now is has become less and less available, and I find that's a really difficult thing. Hopefully, the apprenticeship schemes that are trying to be set up will improve that. But we need people to be able to make calls on trees, because otherwise you get a risk-averse management approach, because people are terrified of things like this happening to that car. But if you follow the guidance in the National Tree Safety Group document, then you know the principles in that are something to follow very well. Okay, we have one final slide, please. Okay. This is why we don't plant poplars next to houses, Paul. This house did have, as you can see, I think this house has been demolished now. It was beyond repair, and there was a willow right next door to it. I put it in there as well because it was a frustrating thing, because we were asked to cut down our oak trees, which were over 30 metres away from this property. There was no way they caused any of the damage. The willow had done that level of damage. That is just another element of risk that we do have to manage. We can do it, and if we follow the guidance that we wrote at the LTOA that we've just rewritten, because obviously that's back to 2008, so there's been a few court cases that has informed our decision making. Then that document should, I hope, be published this year, if not very early next year. Okay, I think that's me.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Andy. That was really, really fascinating, and it's prompted quite a few questions in the Q&A. So we'll get back to those very shortly. But next up is Sophie Leguil. Now, the fabulous thing about More Than Weeds, which is the initiative that Sophie's involved in, is something that really plays to my heart as well. I used to be a local authority officer. I used to work in a highways team, Andy.
Oh, really?
Horror. Yeah. And one of the things that they did in a rural county was they used to cut the hedgerows severely, and they used to do it willy-nilly of nesting birds. And finally, the British Trust for Ornithology somehow managed to persuade highway officers to consider not cutting hedgerows. Now, what Sophie's done is, and is promoting at the moment, is something against pesticide use. So, Sophie, over to you on what do we find at the stumps at the base of tree trunks in our street trees?
Thank you, Andrew. I'm just going to try and share my screen. That's all right. There we go. Okay, can everyone see the presentation? Good, all good. Perfect. So yeah, basically I'm not going to talk about trees, but I'm going to talk about what's at the bottom of the trees, which is quite interesting. So first, I just wanted to give you a very, very quick overview of the types of tree pits that you'll find in streets. When you walk around London, you may see anything from gravel, concrete, resins, all sorts of mineral tree pits. The second one is something that I don't particularly like seeing. Usually it doesn't happen as much in London, but in other cities you may see tree pits where all the vegetation has been glyphosated. Then you may see very natural tree pits. This one is in Hackney, and you can see I've chalked a poppy name on the street there. So this is a tree pit where the spontaneous vegetation has been allowed to grow. And then at the end of the scale, on the right, you'll see a tree pit where local residents have been planting forget-me-nots, honesty, all sorts of ornamental plants. So there's a whole range of different tree pits when you walk around London. But in most cases, you actually find, and even when you talk to, some tree enthusiasts, you actually find that the tree pit is the neglected part of the cityscape and of the streetscape. So it's usually a place, where dogs poo and pee, where you'll find rubbish, places that get trampled as well. So you'll have a very compacted soil, those sort of things. It's not a place that is necessarily seen as a green space. But when you look in detail at what you'll find in tree pits, well, you have a whole range of spontaneous flora. So I've just got a few examples from my local streets. I live in Kennington, and these are mostly examples from my local streets taken in the past few months. You'll have very small annual plants like chickweed, to more showy ones like Oxford ratworts. This one, the one at the bottom in the middle, rapeseed, was in Covent Garden, and it was a rapeseed plant, which you'll typically see in a field, growing at the bottom of that tree in a very urban environment. Then you may see things very common like shepherd's purse, and some grasses as well. So wall barley is very common at the moment, that grass in the top right-hand corner. And you also get rockets, so there's a whole range of plants. I've been trying to find information. I've started a catalogue of those plants, and I haven't been able to find information about London. But some studies have been done in Paris, and they've actually found out that there are at least about 200 plant species in the tree pits in Paris. Some of them have only got one or two. Some of the richest tree pits have up to 25 different spontaneous plant species. And so I wanted to sort of have a look at a little bit about the benefits of those plants. Are they just there, growing spontaneously, or do they actually have any benefits? And the benefits are numerous. However, when you look in, scientific literature, there's actually very little to quantify them. And I think that's probably why, they haven't been properly considered. You never hear about the flora of tree pits as such. In contrast with trees, we know now that trees help reduce temperature, they help with shading, they help absorb pollution, those sort of things. We've been able to quantify those benefits, but not as much as we haven't been able to do as much with the flora of the tree pits. And so some of the benefits of those plants includes pollution. So for example, in some cities, they've started planting hedges along busy roads to absorb some of that pollution. So those plants could have that role. They can alleviate the flood risk. So we've been talking about SUDs, sustainable drainage, those sort of things, and having plants in the tree pits can reduce that risk because those plants may be able to absorb some of that extra water. They're obviously food for insects, and it's not only when they've got flowers. So what we don't necessarily realize is that many of those plants have got benefits for caterpillars. So even before the plants are actually flowering, they've already been, used by some caterpillars of butterflies, moth, flies, etc., for food. They can help with tree health. And I know this is going to be an interesting discussion, possibly. So if you look in literature, you'll find a lot of evidence saying that all the trees, the tree pit should be weeded. But when you look in more detail, there's evidence for very young trees, so trees between 1 and 3 years, so when they've been planted and about up to 3 years. But after that, there seems to be evidence of the contrary, the fact that having some sort of cover on the soil could actually protect the trees from trampling. So if you've got plants, people are less likely to basically walk under that tree. They can absorb a little bit of the urine from dogs and people sometimes, and they can also retain some moisture, especially in dry summers. Finally, obviously, you've got the aesthetics. Some people quite like, having a little bit of countryside in the city, and it can help connect people with nature. And the initiative that I launched in November, and I have been working on for the past couple of months, called More Than Weeds, has been really interesting because I've had hundreds of emails of people saying, I've walked in my streets, I haven't been able, to go further because of the lockdown, but I've walked in my local streets and I've noticed for the first time, the yellow flowers at the bottom of the trees in my road. And I think that's quite an interesting mindset, something people will go to a park to see nature, but they might not realize that there is nature, even if they only have a tree in their street. So these are just a couple of examples of, I've been posting tweets, I've been chalking plant names in the street to educate people. But it's not only about educating people. I think it's also about, making them notice, even if they don't remember that the plant is called a shepherd's purse, they will at least notice it, take some time to look at it. And I think there's a parallel, with getting people to notice trees. There's been a whole trend for, that makes people want to look at nature, want to absorb nature. And there's been a huge interest in having more trees, people requesting them from their council, that sort of things. So I think it'd be really interesting in the future to have a more integrated approach and consider what's at the bottom of the trees as well as what's up. And just a very small statistics to end my presentation. This is a tweet that I posted and it got really widely shared. So this is a figure I found, you can correct me if it's wrong, but I found that there are about 900,000 street trees in London. And so I did a bit of calculation saying if each of those trees had a small tree pit, 60 by 60 centimeter, the average, the total green space that these would represent would be about 32 hectares, which is the size of St. James's Park. So if you took all those little street trees and tree pits, and you converted them from, concrete or like you said, you see here tarmac to some sort of greenery, then you have quite a substantial amount of green space added to the city. I completely appreciate, that it can't be done everywhere, that in some areas the pavement is very narrow, but I think that encouraging a form of greening, whether it's through, spontaneous flora or people planting flowers, as long as it's done properly, considering the tree health and that sort of thing, I think it'd be really interesting and something to look forward to in the future. Thank you.
Well, that's terrific. Thank you very much, Sophie. Sophie was very good because I just sent her a message saying she'd only got a couple of minutes left and she'd finished on the dot. So we very much appreciate that. And that was an intriguing presentation too. So we've got quite a few questions in the questions and answers box. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to sort of wrap 2 or 3 questions up together because something we notice when we go out on the narrow footways of London is the cramped spaces that you have to plant trees, and also the for accessibility issues, it's very difficult to, if you're in a wheelchair or you're pushing children in buggies, to weave your way between tree and the edge of the building line. So I'd be just interested if we could explore what are the best street trees to plant to counter that, and what can we do to encourage, as Sophie suggests, more planting around the base of trees and yet not restrict access. Anyone like to I've just thrown in 3 questions all in one. So who would like to have a go? Andy, would you like to have a pitch in first?
Yes, I suppose. Street tree planting is challenging. There's no doubt. I think people are asking what's your favourite tree, and that's been going on. And mine's are cherries. They're great, but cherries react badly with the stock. The scion does, and they smash the hell out of the footway a lot of the time. So how do we keep that tree? And one of the things that we've done is we've redesigned our new tree pits, if you like. So when we plant in a pit that's 1.2 meters laterally and only 60 centimeters going into the footway. So we try and impact as minimal as we can for pedestrian use, but we can do it laterally so the roots can go that way and access the water and stuff they need. The other option that we've got, which we haven't looked into enough, I don't think, is having build outs and actually planting trees in the road at the beginning and the end of parking bays, if you like. I think it's something because we are going to lose, we ain't going to have space. Barbara Milne did one on Monday where she showed some streets in Westminster where people can hardly walk down those streets, let alone plant trees in them. So I would say that it's always going to be a problem, and currently we are fighting for that room with lamp columns, with cables, with pedestrians. I think maybe we could be a bit clever and move out into the road.
Of course, with COVID-19 and social distancing, there's quite a lot of push behind the idea of widening footways and taking space from the highway, which of course is unheard of. My former highway colleagues would not have any of that. So Paul or Sophie, would you like to comment anything about on sort of what's the best street tree to plant? And Paul, do you want to have a pitch at that?
Well, okay. I mean, there's, as I'm sure many of the people on these panels have said, there's the mantra of the right tree for the right place, which holds true. But the right tree is the issue, because there's a lot to choose from. And I think there's lots of things which I find very interesting. What I find interesting about walking down the street is finding trees which I don't know what they are, like the one that I showed Andy. And I was thinking about that, and I think it might be Celtis occidentalis, because I've never seen one of those, and I think that might be what it was. So that sort of thing is what intrigues me, and I think I'm coming very much from a pedestrian point of view, someone that's looking at the trees with an interest in the variety and so on. I like to be surprised. I also like some things where, for instance, I live in the borough of Islington, but I live very, very close to Haringey and Hackney. And in Hackney, some of the streets there have it's sort of almost like going into botanical gardens, where you'll get a whole series of trees from the same genus. So you'll see 12 different types of birch or 12 different types of sorbus. And I find that absolutely fascinating, because I can compare and contrast. I recognise that that's a rather minority interest, though. But if I had to pick one tree, I have to say the best street tree for me is always going to be the London plane.
And Sophie, over to you. What's the best tree for encouraging plant life in the tree pit?
I think it's not necessarily about the tree as such. It's probably about the diversity of trees. I mean, I've lived in France, in Belgium, and there's been a huge trend over there to no longer have the same avenue of typical cherries or plane trees, but to have a really wide range, wide diversity of plants and of trees in the streets. So you'll have one of each will be a different tree. And although it challenges your perception of the typical landscape, it's very efficient in terms of resistance to climate change, diseases. So if you've got a problem with one particular tree, it's not going to spread to the whole street, and you won't have to fell the whole street, for example. So I think in terms of tree diversity, that's probably the best, and something that I would like to see happening in London as well. For tree pits, well, I don't think the diversity of the tree pits, of plants at the tree pits, is linked to the tree, but it's more about good practice in terms of how the tree is planted. So in some places, I'll see poor trees with a very, very heavily compacted soil, and that's not good for plants, but it's probably not good for the tree either. So I think, it would really benefit both the tree and the plants under the tree if good practice could be more widespread, I would say.
I'm quite interested in maybe working with you, Sophie, and seeing if we can't do this because we're planting the best part of 1,000 street trees a year up in Barnet, and we could potentially trial some of this.
But I was going to ask Andy, because another question in here is about the crumb. Does the crumb allow floor planting or flowers to come through? Or...
I wouldn't have thought so, but in our newly planted trees, we don't use rubber crumb. We just put back wood chip as mulch. But we could obviously plant up a few bulbs or seeds or whatever it is then at the same time.
The trend in France has been to use sand and gravel, and then planting kind of more brown tree or flora. So basically mimicking nature, the type of plant, the spontaneous plant, that the one I've got in the background, but to try and get more ornamental planting. So poppy is a good example, but you get some more sustainable ones as well, which A, look good, and B, are easy maintenance.
Okay, all right, well, let's give it a go.
I mean, something that's come up in the questions too, of course, is going to be the question about how much influence do insurance companies have, and also the issue, I think, which Paul hinted at, which was that at certain periods in our history, people have embraced having trees planted in their streets because they increase the value of the properties in which they live. So there's a sort of cross there. It's the cost of the insurers, the pressure of insurance companies, and the increasing value of trees. Is Andy, a tough one, I know, to sort of answer in a couple of minutes, but
not really. I think that if you're aware of a risk, then you have to deal with it. It's pretty much a legal requirement. And if you deal with it correctly, then you can stop your trees from being cut down. Before Paul gets run over in Finsbury Park, you can see that the big planes behind him are being managed on a cycle, and that's to reduce the water that the trees need. It's the water extraction that causes the soil underneath buildings to drop and crack. So if we're aware of this risk, then we need to manage it. That's fine. So the insurance have got an influence in as such as they will act on behalf of their clients, and try and get us to pay for some of the damage that our trees may or may not cause. I think people are becoming more and more aware of the benefits of trees, far more over the past 5 years. We're getting far more requests to plant trees now than ever before. And I think a lot of that's to do with the publicity with regard to air quality, because for the last 2 or 3 years, there's been so much press. And, if you watch BBC London News, at some point it was almost daily that they were talking about the air quality in London, and people have just become far more aware. We're getting lots of requests to plant more trees, and I think the worm has turned a little bit.
Okay, well, we're almost out of time. So what I'm going to suggest that we do for the Urban Tree Festival is that we save the chat and have a sort of FAQ on the Urban Tree Festival site where we answer some of the questions that have come from all the webinars, and get some written answers on so that people can come back to the festival site and have a look at those. I want to thank the panelists for their really interesting presentations, but I want to sort of ask them one last question to chip in. At the moment, thinking about we're all confined, what's their vision for the next couple of seasons? What should we be looking out for with our street trees over summer and then coming into autumn? What would you suggest people look out for? Do you want to try that, Paul? Or?
Yeah, okay. Well, I was thinking just in terms of, what you're going to notice in the next month or two is you're going to start noticing some of the trees which are starting to flower at this time of year. So the hibiscus is a summer flowering tree. And you might also look out for golden rain tree or the pride of India, which has yellow flowers which appear in July. Another one to look out for is the Indian horse chestnut, which is also coming into flower fairly soon. Looks like a horse chestnut, more elegant and later flowering.
Sophie, do you want to have a go? What flora should we be looking out for? Spring flowers. What's going on at the ground?
Well, I have to say it's been particularly dry around London. And I'm starting to notice some of the pavement plants dying back at the moment, and planting tree beds dying back as well. So I don't think it's going to be quite, unless there is, rain in the next couple of weeks. I don't think it's going to be an amazing show of tree pit plants. But usually it's actually quite a good sign. I've had people ask me, when should we water a tree, for example? And actually looking at the plants in the tree pit can give you a pretty good indication, how dry the soil might be, especially for young trees. So I think it can be quite a good proxy. I'll be posting, lots of pictures of what I find in terms of those plants. But I don't think it's going to be an amazing show because of the drought, I have to say.
And finally, Andy.
I think the people have, our parks are busier. That's for sure. I think that what's happened over the past 6-7 weeks is that people have started to appreciate the green space in London much more, and appreciate birds. There's been a massive increase in birds as far as I can work out where I live. People are going out and utilising the green space, which makes this city so great and livable. I mean, I think that without it, I was asked the other day about what do I like about trees and stuff, and I was like, but living in London is tough, but this gives us all a sensitivity, and I think it helps with the day-to-day life of living here. I think people are appreciating trees and green spaces far more, and the nature that they host.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all the panelists. Thank you to everyone who's attended. We've got more webinars coming up. Please look out for, come back and look at the festival website. Pick off some of the ones you want. We've still got capacity on many of them. Neil has put forward a fantastic array of speakers. We're only on day 6. We have at least 3.5 days left. So I just want to wrap it up and say thank you very much to all of you attending. We're all volunteers. We've all put in loads and loads of time and effort on this. If there's any way you could perhaps pop your hand in your pocket and make us a donation, we'd be really grateful, because we'd like to continue with the festival in future years. So thanks to everyone here, and I'm going to close the meeting now. Over to Neil to close it.
Hello, thanks Andrew, and thanks everyone for a fascinating series of talks and questions.